Okay. I'd like to talk about how you can find the domain of a function algebraically. Uh, Usually, I look for the two things, the denominator, or fraction, and the square root, y. Well, the fraction. If you have a variable in the denominator, then you have to be careful because if the denominator equals to zero, you cannot divide by zero, right? Then your function is undefined. So you need to find those values and exclude them from your domain. The square root, well, we all know that the square root of a negative number does not exist. Again, your function is undefined at whatever that point is. Then you need to exclude those values, or maybe it's the whole interval. Let me show you a couple of examples. So example number one. Let me start with a simple one. So f of x equals to, let's say we have 2x over x plus 1. Okay, at this point I don't really care what my graph looks like. I just want to find the domain algebraically. So as I said, you need to at this point you need to worry about two things. You're worried about the denominators, or you're worried about the square roots. So we don't have a square root here, but we do have the denominator. So what makes your denominator equals to 0? So, well, let's see. If x is negative 1, then the whole thing becomes 0 because negative 1 plus 1 is 0. And you cannot divide by 0. So, but if you have to show your work, which I always, I always ask my students to show their work. It's very important. So then this is what you do. You say x plus 1, you say equals to 0, and let me solve it and see what that bad value is. Bad value is negative 1. So we got that. You can circle it for yourself, but you're not done yet. Now, I do want you to write your final answer in interval notation. So how do we do that? So at this point you say, well, the domain would be all real numbers. Anything would work in this case, except for negative 1. But you don't want to write that whole sentence. So as your answer, you're going to say, well, negative infinity, so any negative number works in this case, all the way to negative 1. Obviously, you don't want to include the negative 1. That's why I'm using parentheses. The bracket, you would use a bracket if you want to include that particular value. But in this case, we don't want to include it. So it is a bad number. So that's why we're using the parentheses. And then union, because we have more, from negative 1 and never ends, positive infinity. So on your number line, any x value would work except for negative 1. So that guy is the bad value. So that's it. That would be your answer. So this would be your final answer. Let's move on. So let's say we want to find the domain of the function g of x that equals to, let's say 3 plus x over the square root of x minus 4. Okay, so as I said, you need to focus on two things. If you have a fraction, then you're worried about the denominator. If you have the square root expression, you're worried about that value, what's in your square root, because it can be negative. So we have both. We have a fraction and we have the square root. Now, by the way, I don't really care what's happening in the numerator right now, because the numerator can be any number, right? It could be 0, positive, negative, billion, whatever. As long as you don't have the square root in your numerator, then don't even look at it. You are worried about your denominator, and you're worried about your square root expression. So how do we find the domain in this case? So you need to show your work. So you say first, the square root of x minus 4, that's the whole denominator. Let's solve it, equals to 0. Let's solve this equation. What makes this whole thing equals to 0? Well, you don't really need to do much. You can tell it's x equals to 4. So if x equals to 4, if you plug in, you're going to get 0 at the bottom, which is not okay. So you want to exclude that value. So basically, you can circle this, or if you're afraid that you are going to forget about this bad value, you can just put not equal to 4, not equal to 4. This way you remember, you have to exclude it. You have to exclude it. Okay, so what else do we have? Well, we have the square root, right? Expression. And we know that the value of whatever you have in your square root, it has to be positive. Obviously, it can't be 0 in this particular case because the denominator cannot be 0. But it has to be positive. So, again, how do you show your work? So you say, well, the value that I have, the whole thing I have, the whole expression in my square root, x minus 4, it has to be greater than 0. Normally, you would say greater than or equal to, but it can be equal to 0. I just said that it can be 0 because the denominator cannot be equal to 0. So you just say the strict inequality x minus 4 is greater than 0. Solve it. So you get x is greater than 4. Okay, circle it for yourself. So you notice we have two things. We have this and we have that. Now we just need to put it together and write our final answer. So what do? We say, answer. Okay, so let me show you the number line. So that 4 is the bad guy, right? This is your 4, right? Now, x is not equal to 4, so that covers this. Now, let's see. It also says x has to be greater than 4. X has to be greater than 4. So everything after 4 would be okay, right? So your answer is going to look like this. Parentheses again, because you don't want to include that bad value. So you say 4, comma, and number ends to infinity. So this would be your final answer. Let me make it yellow. Final answer to this question. So I hope this makes sense. Now, I would like you to try a couple of problems by yourselves. So let me just erase maybe this first problem here. All right, it's all erased. And here's your question. So please try it. Okay, let's call it k of x equals, and let's say we have x squared minus 1 over 5 minus x. And then the other one, so that would be question, let's call it question A. And question B, let's call it maybe m of x equals the square root of x minus 3 over, let's make it x minus 4. Let's see if you can figure it out. Well, I hope you were able to solve it. Let me show you my work, and hopefully you guys got the same answers. So let's see. So for this one, so in this case, well, I do have a fraction. Nothing is happening here in the numerator. It's just x squared minus 1, no square roots, so I'm not worried about that. I do want to focus on my denominator, and I know that the denominator cannot be equal to 0. So I say 5 minus x equals to 0, and let me solve it. So x equals 5 is a bad number. So as I said, you can just put not equal to 5 if you want, circle it, and that's it. So we're done. So everything is good except for x equals to 5. So your answer is going to say negative infinity to 5, obviously parentheses, and union 5 to positive infinity. Done. So finish this one. Now let's move on to question B. Well, in this case, it looks like it's a little bit more complicated because we have both. We have the square root and we have the denominator with the variable in it. So one step at a time. So we have this numerator with the square root. So you're gonna say x minus 3 has to be greater than or equal to 0. First of all, it's the numerator, so numerator can be equal to 0, and the square root of 0 exists, so we're good. Solve it, so you get x has to be greater than or equal to 3. So I'm just gonna circle that for myself. Next, let's move on to our denominator. What makes this denominator the 0? X equals to 4. But you do need to show your work. So you say x equals to 4 equals to 0, or when x is 4. Well, let's say not equal to 4 because it is a bad number. Now, let's show on the number line. You don't have to, but it always helps. So 3, it says or equal to. You see right here, we said it can be equal to 3 because if x is 3, the numerator becomes 0, which is okay. So that's why I'm going to fill it in. X equals to 4, but that's one of those bad numbers, so I'm not going to fill it in. Now, back to this statement. It says greater than 3, greater than or equal to 3. So anything after that, whatever is greater than 3 would be okay. But remember, you don't want to include that 4, right? So how do you show your answer? So we're moving left to right. In this case, I'm starting with 3, and I'm using brackets, right? Because I do want to grab that number. I want to include that number. And then you don't want to say 3 to positive infinity. That would be wrong, because you do want to break it into 2 separate intervals because of this bad number. So you say from 3 to 4, obviously, parentheses, union, and then from 4 to positive infinity. Done. So these are the 2 answers, and hopefully you got the same thing. But I'm gonna check. If you have any questions, please let me know. Look, Jackie, you're driving me crazy. Oh.